Bien, nous allons maintenant entendre le dernier duo de cet après-midi, donc Dan Garber qui parlera des usages politiques des superstitions et Chantal Jaquet qui va lui répondre. Tu as la parole.
Merci beaucoup. Premièrement, je voudrais remercier les organisateurs de cette colloque qui est vraiment intéressant d'avoir ce groupe de chercheurs ensemble dans la même salle. C'est très, très intéressant. Je parle en anglais, mais il y a le texte qui quelqu'un distribue à ce moment, mais aussi il y a trois handouts. Un handout en anglais pour les anglophones, un handout en français pour les francophones et un handout en latin pour les latinophones. Avec les textes. Les deux ou les trois à la fois. Okay, let me speak in English now. In the very first sentence of the preface of his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus, Spinoza comments on how we come to be bound by superstition. If men could manage all their affairs by a definite plan, or fortune were always favorable to them, they would never be possessed by superstition. And this is quotation one on the handout. Superstition is one of the central themes of the preface that follows. Spinoza explains what it is, how it arises, and generally bemoans the tendency people have toward superstitious beliefs and practices. One could reasonably expect that one of the main themes of the book that follows will be the elimination of superstition and its replacement by a more enlightened form of religion at very least, if not by reason. At the very end of chapter 11 of the TTP, Spinoza writes, "How happy our age would surely be now if we saw religion again free of all superstition." But I shall argue, the argument is more complicated than that. In the end, I argue, Spinoza does not eliminate superstition completely, but in a way transforms it into something positive, something that will lead people to virtue and support the stability of society. Okay, by the way, before I continue, let me remark that the quotations from the TTP are from Ed Curley's translation. I am afraid, though, that, the volume 2 just came out. Unfortunately, this may be a melange of earlier versions. I haven't yet gone through and made it all quite correct. But in any case, let me continue. Spinoza begins the preface of the TTP with some thoughts about superstition. On his view, superstition is closely linked with fear. And this is quotation 3 on the handout. We could give a great many examples which would show most clearly that men struggle with superstition only so long as they are in fear, that all the things that they have ever worshipped in illusory religion have been nothing but apparitions, the delusions of a sad and timid mind, and finally that seers have held the greatest control over the common people and been most dangerous to their kings when states have been in the greatest difficulties. Now, how exactly is this supposed to work? The kind of fear that Spinoza has in mind, I think, arises from the lack of control that we have over things in the world. Here again is the opening passage of the preface, and this is quotation 1 on the handout. If men could manage all their affairs by a definite plan, or if fortune were always favorable to them, they would never be possessed by superstition. But often they are in such straits that they cannot decide on any plan. For the most part, they vacillate wretchedly between hope and fear because of the uncertain goods of fortune, which they desire immoderately. In particular, the fear that moves them to superstition seems to be the fear that we may lose things that are important to us. Again, in the preface he writes, and this is quotation 2, we see that the men most thoroughly enslaved to every kind of superstition are the ones who immoderately desire uncertain goods, and that they all invoke divine aid with prayers and unmanly tears, especially when they are in danger and cannot help themselves. Because reason cannot show a certain way to the hollow things they desire, they call it blind, and human wisdom vain. The delusions of the imagination, on the other hand, and dreams and childish follies they believe to be divine answers. The superstition to which this fear leads us is the positing of a God who imposes a kind of order in the world, an order that isn't really there. We want to know what will give us some certainty, what will help us become rich or successful, and will help us to get the material things in the world. We therefore suppose order and patterns in nature, hidden messages from God where there are none. When fearful people become frustrated with reason, which, quote, cannot show a certain way to the hollow things they desire, they believe God rejects the wise and writes his decrees not in the mind but in the entrails of animals, and that fools, madmen, and birds predict his decrees by divine inspiration and prompting. And they then pray to this God to help them overcome their fear by ensuring that they can get what they want. This, then, is superstition. The belief that there is a hidden order imposed by God or the gods, and that if we pray in the appropriate way, we will gain the control over our lives that we seek, currently without success. This teleological conception of nature is, in greater generality, what Spinoza develops more systematically and in more detail in the appendix to Ethics 1. In that appendix, Spinoza begins by reviewing what he takes himself to have proved in the body of Ethics 1, that God exists, that he is unique, etc. But then he turns to the main business of the appendix, addressing directly the, quote, prejudices that could prevent my demonstrations from being perceived. Like Bacon and Descartes before him, Spinoza thinks that we are all naturally led into errors that cloud the mind and must be eliminated before we can perceive the truth. This is his suggestion about where it is that we go wrong. And this is quotation 4 on the handout. All the prejudices I here undertake to expose depend on this one, that men commonly suppose that all natural things act as men do on account of an end. Indeed, they maintain and is certain that God himself directs all things to some certain end. For they say that God has made all things for man, and man that he might worship God. In short, the central prejudice that Spinoza recognizes is the teleological conception of nature, the idea that everything has a purpose given to it by God. Spinoza then goes on to offer a diagnosis of how this prejudice arises, to give a series of arguments intended to attack it directly, and to give an account of the other errors that this prejudice leads us to make. Most interesting from the perspective of my interests here is the account that Spinoza gives of why people all have a tendency to hold a teleological view of nature. People begin, Spinoza says, with a mistaken belief that they have a free will. And since they always act for an end, they assume that everything in nature is there for a purpose as well, put there by a god or gods for their benefit. This in turn led people to worship God, who created such a world, quote, so that God might love them above all the rest, and direct the whole of nature according to the needs of their blind desire and insatiable greed. And here we are on the familiar ground that we saw covered in the preface of the TTP. It is our cupidity that leads us to pray to God in order to satisfy our, quote, blind desire and insatiable greed. In this way, Spinoza writes, and this is quotation 5, This prejudice was changed into superstition and struck deep roots in their minds. In this way, the teleological conception of nature in the appendix to Ethics 1 is closely linked with the discussion of superstition in the TTP. At the core of superstition in both texts is what Spinoza considers to be the central prejudice that prevents us from grasping the truth about things, the teleological conception of nature. It is a central goal of the ethics to eradicate this prejudice to which we are all strongly inclined and replace our mistaken teleological conception of nature with a true conception of God and the nature of things, and in this way eliminate the grounds of superstition altogether. But, I claim, Spinoza takes a very different strategy in the TTP. At this point, I would like to turn back to the TTP, to themes that may seem at first entirely unrelated to the question of superstition, obedience to the moral law, and what Spinoza calls the dogmas of universal faith. And in my account of these themes, I'm drawing heavily on another paper that I published. In the TTP, Spinoza argues that the central teaching of revelation is not knowledge, strictly speaking, but a command, and this is quotation 6. For from Scripture itself, we have perceived its general tendency without any difficulty or ambiguity to love God above all else and to love your neighbor as yourself. And insofar as the central teaching of revealed religion is a command, the central teaching of Scriptures must be seen as obedience to this command. In the title of chapter 13, for example, Spinoza notes that Scripture, quote, does not aim at anything but obedience. The love of God and of one's neighbor is, for Spinoza, central to the practice of religion. Not surprisingly, this is what reason teaches as well, as Spinoza argues in Ethics 4 and 5. The rational person loves his neighbor as himself, and like himself, tries to make his neighbor more and more rational, because in doing so, he makes his neighbor a suitable member of a common society. And the idea that insofar as we are rational and we love God above all is a central conclusion of Ethics 5, the ground of eternity and beatitude. It is not surprising that these same conclusions, conceived now as commands to be obeyed, rather than the consequences of rational deliberation, appear as the teachings of revelation. But imperfectly rational people can't learn to love their neighbors and God as eternal truths, which can be established through reason. They need to be convinced to regard them as commands, and they need to be convinced to obey them. This, for Spinoza, is where faith enters. And this is Spinoza's definition of faith. And I think this is different from what the translation that Ed Curley came up with. It's a very difficult passage. But as I read it, it goes as follows. And this is quotation 8. And you can look at the Latin if you want to have a different version. I shall begin with a definition of faith, which according to the foundation we have given, must be defined as follows. Thinking such things about God that if the person disregards them, obedience to God is destroyed, and such that if obedience to God is posited, they are necessarily posited. Faith involves thinking things, that is, holding the opinion that certain propositions are true. These propositions are beliefs such that if you hold them, then you are necessarily obedient to the central command of revealed religion. And similarly, if you are obedient to the central command of revealed religion, then you necessarily hold these beliefs. But what exactly are the beliefs that, for Spinoza, are taken to support obedience? The issue receives its longest and most careful development in chapter 14, where Spinoza sets out what he calls the dogmas of universal faith, or the tenets of universal faith, fide universalis dogmata. Spinoza enumerates these as follows, and I'm not going to read all of the text, but you've got the text in front of you, that God exists, that he's unique, that he's present everywhere, and everything is open to him, that he has the supreme right and dominion over all things, that everyone is absolutely bound to obey him, but he's not bound to obey anybody else, that the worship of God and obedience to him consists only in justice and loving kindness, that is, in the love of one's neighbor, that all and only those who obey God by living in this way are saved, and the rest are lost, and finally that God pardons the sins of those who repent. There's more there, but you can read those. These then are the propositions which, if genuinely believed, that is, genuinely held to be true by someone, will guarantee that he will be obedient to the command to love God and his neighbor. And in turn, anyone who is obedient to the command is obligated to believe these. Before unpacking these articles of faith and understanding their connection with obedience, let me begin with the notion of obedience itself. Spinoza's conception of obedience is greatly clarified in one of the later notes he added to the TTP. The note is added to a text from chapter 16, and in that chapter he writes, this is passage 10. No one knows by nature that he is bound by any obedience to God. Indeed, no one can attain this knowledge by reason at all, but only by revelation confirmed by signs. Interesting. This is the only thing that we can that in the Bible that we learn by revelation that can't be learned from reason. Obedience is the only thing that we have to have revelation for. And in the later note, Spinoza makes the following remarks, and this is passage 11. And it's a long passage, but a very important one. The love of God is not obedience, but a virtue which is necessarily in the man who rightly knows God. Obedience, on the other hand, is concerned with the will of the one commanding, not with the necessity and truth of the matter. We have shown that the divine laws seem to us to be laws, that is, things instituted just as long as we do not know their cause. But when this is known, they thereby, which is to say, when we know their cause, they thereby cease to be laws, and we embrace them not as laws, that is something commanded to us, but as eternal truths. That is, obedience passes into love, which proceeds from true knowledge as necessarily as light does from the sun. So we can indeed love God according to the guidance of reason, but we cannot obey him according to the guidance of reason, since by reason we can neither embrace divine laws as divine so long as we are ignorant of their cause, nor conceive of God as establishing these laws like a prince. Spinoza's position seems to be this. Now, for the person who has true knowledge, loving God is something we do of necessity, as necessarily as light passes from the sun. However, not everyone is in this cognitive state. For those who aren't, they must conceive of loving God as if it were commanded by a prince. In this way, while the perfectly rational person will love God, he will not do so out of obedience, strictly speaking. Knowing that God is not the kind of being that gives commands to the extent that we are rational, we simply can't obey God. Obedience to the moral law is in this way appropriate only for those who follow the moral law because they believe that they are commanded to do so, and not because they understand through reason that they should. The rational person embraces the moral law, quote, not as laws, but as eternal truths. This, in turn, illuminates the way in which the dogmas of universal faith are connected with obedience. The person with limited intellect doesn't see how the imperative to love God and his neighbor are eternal truths, which once understood must be followed. Instead, he sees them as laws, commands, like the laws that a prince decrees for his subjects. If he genuinely believes that there is a God who is a supreme being, merciful, just, and worthy of love, and at the same time is a lawgiver and a judge, omnipresent, omnipotent, and whose will we are bound to obey, then he will be obedient to God. If, on the other hand, such a person were to be obedient and determined to follow the command to love God and his neighbor, then it is not unreasonable for him to believe that there is a God who had exactly the properties ascribed to him in Spinoza's Dogmas of Universal Faith, that he is supreme, merciful, just, a lawgiver, and a judge, omnipresent, omnipotent, etc. The general idea should be clear enough. Obedience to the moral law is closely connected with a belief in the existence of a moral lawgiver, a model of rectitude who demands our obedience. Now, Spinoza says, it doesn't matter whether these dogmas of universal faith are true or false. What is important is that belief in them are required for people to be obedient to the moral law, and that obedience to the moral law requires that they be believed. This is quotation 12. Faith does not require dogmas which are true as much as it does dogmas which are pious, that is, dogmas which move the heart to obedience, even if there are many among them which have not even a shadow of the truth, so long as the person who accepts them does not know them to be false. Otherwise, he would necessarily be a rebel. For how could it happen that someone who is eager to love justice and to obey God should worship as divine something he knows to be foreign to the divine nature? Many of the dogmas Spinoza sets out among the dogmas of universal faith are literally true within Spinoza's philosophy. Certainly God exists for Spinoza, as asserted in the first dogma, at least as he understands what God is. God is certainly unique for Spinoza, dogma 2, present everywhere, dogma 3, and acts only by his nature, dogma 4. But there are at least some of the dogmas in Spinoza's list that are very difficult indeed to fit into his own philosophy. As Spinoza understands God, it is very difficult to construe him as supremely just as merciful, a model exemplar of true life, as a judge. These are definitely anthropomorphic conceptions of God, which Spinoza denies both in the Ethics and in other places in the TTP. Nor is it easy to see how Spinoza's philosophy could accommodate the belief that God pardons the sins of those who repent. Leaving aside the evident anthropomorphism in that dogma, in the Ethics, Spinoza is quite clear that repentance is inappropriate for the rational person. Indeed, the whole spirit of the dogmas of universal faith are strikingly inconsistent with Spinoza's philosophy. If the dogmas of universal faith are supposed to underlie the view of God as the supreme prince and lawgiver, to whom obedience is due and who will punish us for failing to be obedient, then it is very difficult to see how any set of dogmas could support or follow from obedience could fail to be inconsistent with Spinoza's radically anti-anthropomorphic view of God in the Ethics. At this point, we can return to the question of superstition. I began by showing how superstition for Spinoza is grounded in a teleological conception of the world. The fundamental error that leads to superstition is the teleological conception of nature, the view that everything in nature has a purpose, which was put there by agents, God or gods, who act as we do and choose things for a reason, ultimately in order to induce men to love them and to worship them. Now, in the Ethics, Spinoza presents a radically different conception of God and nature, one in which there is no room for such a teleological perspective. Within the context of the Ethics, the philosopher comes to understand the moral law, to love your neighbor as yourself and to love God above all, as eternal truths that we follow on the basis of reason alone. However, in the TTP, the situation is quite different. For the imperfectly rational masses, the moral law is presented as a law, which is to be followed out of obedience and not out of understanding. But to be obedient, the imperfectly rational person requires faith, the belief in an omnipotent lawgiver who imposes order on the world, who will reward those who obey his laws and punish those who violate them. This, in essence, is the teleological conception of nature, which is to say, obedience requires that the imperfectly rational person hold a teleological conception of nature, the very conception of the world that underlies superstition. What Spinoza has done here is remarkable. He has taken the teleological conception of nature, the fundamental and deep-seated prejudice that grounds superstition, and transformed it into something positive, the grounds of obedience to the moral law. The philosopher who can follow the argument of the Ethics doesn't need it, of course. For the philosopher, the moral law, love your neighbor as yourself and love God above all, is grasped as an eternal truth, something that we can know through reason alone, something binding on us as rational beings. But the imperfectly rational person cannot grasp this. Such a person must be convinced to follow the moral law through other means. In the TTP, I would argue, Spinoza teaches us how to live in such a world of imperfectly rational humanity. Rather than abandoning the common people to superstition and the disorder and unhappiness that it leads to, Spinoza shows how the teleological view of the world toward which the common people are strongly inclined can be used as a support not of superstition, but of the moral life. Thank you for your attention.
Merci. Maintenant, nous écoutons la réponse de Chantal.
Merci. Alors, l'originalité de la démarche de Daniel Garber tient au fait qu'il ne considère pas de manière simpliste que la connaissance vraie viendra à bout de la superstition, comme la lumière chasse les ténèbres, mais qu'elle demeure partiellement irréductible et qu'elle a de surcroît une positivité. Sa thèse centrale est que, je cite, Spinoza n'élimine pas complètement la superstition, mais d'une certaine manière la transforme en quelque chose de positif qui conduise les hommes à la vertu et maintienne la stabilité de l'État. Alors, pour établir cette thèse, il analyse d'abord comment la superstition s'enracine dans une vision théologique du monde, en confrontant la préface du traité théologico-politique et l'appendice de la partie 1 de l'éthique, puis il se penche sur les dogmes de la foi universelle en mettant en évidence la vision téléologique qui les sous-tend. Daniel Garber donne ainsi à voir le renversement de perspective qui s'opère chez Spinoza et qui est souvent demeuré inaperçu. Il montre comment la vision théologique du monde critiquée dans l'appendice de la partie 1 de l'éthique peut avoir des effets salutaires en devenant un auxiliaire nécessaire de la vie morale pour les hommes qui ne vivent pas sous la conduite de la raison. Alors l'argument majeur repose sur l'analyse des dogmes de la foi universelle et plus particulièrement sur le fait que le salut par l'obéissance implique la croyance, je cite la page 6, en un Dieu législateur qui impose un ordre au monde et qui récompense ceux qui obéissent à ses lois et punit ceux qui les violent, ce qui est dans son essence même une conception théologique de la nature. Fin de citation. Alors, la mise en parallèle de la genèse de la superstition et de la formation du préjugé de la finalité est très intéressante et très féconde d'un point de vue spéculatif, parce qu'elle permet de mieux comprendre leur imbrication, de la mesurer, et permet de comprendre la manière dont ils se nourrissent l'un de l'autre. Alors, ça appelle un certain nombre de questions et de remarques qui méritent discussion. Je me limiterai à 2. Alors, la première question a trait à la nature exacte de la thèse soutenue par Daniel Garber. En effet, un glissement s'opère au fil de l'exposé de la superstition au préjugé de la finalité et à la conception théologique du monde. Il y a donc un décalage entre le titre annoncé, les usages politiques de la superstition, et ce qui est finalement établi, à savoir l'usage éthique d'une conception théologique du monde. Ce n'est donc pas la superstition en tant que telle qui a une positivité, mais la vision théologique du monde, ce qui n'est pas exactement la même chose. Alors, le fait indéniable que la superstition puisse se nourrir d'une vision téléologique et qu'elle possède une structure analogue à la pensée finaliste n'implique pas leur assimilation. D'où ma question, dans ces conditions, est-ce qu'on peut réduire la superstition aux préjugés de la finalité, les considérer comme des équivalents stricts et passer de l'un à l'autre comme s'ils étaient identiques? Alors, pour formuler la question autrement et lui donner toute son ampleur, est-ce que la croyance dans les dogmes de foi universelle, énoncés par Spinoza au chapitre 14 du TTP, et notamment les dogmes qui mettent en jeu une conception téléologique, est-ce que cette croyance est proprement superstitieuse? Alors, si la réponse est positive, quelle différence faire alors entre ce que Spinoza appelle dans la préface du traité théologico-politique la religio vana, la religion vaine, marquée par la superstition et la crédulité, et la vera religio, la vraie religion, que Spinoza associe à la parole de Dieu, à la foi véritable. Alors, si la foi véritable consiste moins à obéir à des dogmes vrais que pieux, si la foi véritable ne repose pas nécessairement sur des idées adéquates, elle n'est pas réductible pour autant, chez Spinoza, à de la crédulité superstitieuse. En somme, je partage avec Daniel Garber l'idée que la vision théologique inadéquate critiquée dans l'appendice de la partie 1 de l'éthique a une positivité et produit des effets salutaires dans le cadre des dogmes de la foi universelle, mais je ne suis pas convaincu que l'on puisse parler à ce sujet de superstition. En effet, le ressort de cette croyance n'est pas la crainte, mais plutôt la confiance, la foi, dans l'idée que l'amour du prochain, c'est-à-dire la pratique de la justice et de la charité, assure le salut. Donc c'est peut-être le point de discussion. Alors ma deuxième remarque a trait à quelque chose que j'ai trouvé très intéressant, au caractère irréductible et résistant de la superstition, malgré ses formes très labiles, très changeantes. Alors je voudrais proposer ici une interprétation des raisons pour lesquelles la superstition ne peut pas être totalement éradiquée et possède une positivité, donc légèrement différente de celle de Daniel Garber, et lui demander son avis sur ce point. Alors, les raisons de la persistance de la superstition tiennent moins au fait qu'elle s'enracine dans le préjugé de la finalité qu'à la nature de la crainte qui en est à l'origine et à la soumission nécessaire de l'homme à une logique des possibles. Je m'explique. La superstition naît de la crainte, et plus exactement de l'incertitude concernant l'issue, favorable ou non, de nos désirs insatiables. C'est parce que nous ignorons l'issue de ce que nous désirons vivement que nous adoptons des croyances et des pratiques superstitieuses destinées à prévoir et à infléchir le cours de ce qui va advenir. Si les choses sont indifférentes, l'incertitude de leur avènement n'enclenche aucune attitude superstitieuse. Si nous savons que le bien désiré est certain, nous sommes joyeux et en sécurité, et nous ne cédons pas à la superstition. Si nous savons qu'il est impossible que ce bien advienne, la crainte qui cause la superstition disparaît pour faire place à la tristesse et au désespoir. Par conséquent, si nous savions que les choses désirées sont nécessaires ou impossibles, alors il n'y aurait pas de superstition. C'est l'idée du possible avènement de nos insatiables désirs qui explique que la superstition est sans cesse alimentée. Il n'existe pourtant chez Spinoza que deux modalités ontologiques connues, être ou ne pas être, la nécessité ou l'impossibilité. Mais il y a trois modalités anthropologiques vécues, à être ou ne pas être. L'homme ignorant rajoute le peut-être. Dans le Scoli 1 de la proposition 33 de la partie 1 d'éthique, Spinoza précise bien que le possible et le contingent ne sont que des appellations, des manières de parler, reposant sur un défaut de connaissance. Mais ce défaut de connaissance ne conduit pas à faire l'économie de ces concepts, qui font d'ailleurs l'objet d'une définition en bonne et due forme dans l'éthique 4. Je ne reprends pas les définitions 3 et 4 de l'éthique 4. Les modes qui ne comprennent pas de contradiction interne ne peuvent être ni dits impossibles, ni nécessaires, puisque leur essence n'enveloppe pas l'existence. Ils peuvent donc être dits contingents. Alors, la question de la contingence se déplace sur celle de la possibilité, je vous renvoie à la définition 4, parce qu'il s'agit de savoir s'il y a des causes qui rendent impossible ou nécessaire l'existence des choses, étant donné que rien dans leur essence ne permet de trancher en un sens ou l'autre. Par suite, nous ne pouvons pas faire autrement que de raisonner avec la catégorie du possible, tant que nous ignorons si les causes qui posent l'existence de ce que nous désirons sont déterminées ou non à les produire. Cela tient à notre statut ontologique de mode fini, qui ne peuvent embrasser l'enchaînement infini des causes qui sont déterminées à produire ou à ne pas produire un événement. Pour l'usage de la vie, je ne parle pas d'un point de vue ontologique, mais pour l'usage de la vie, il faut donc considérer les choses comme des possibles. Et c'est ce que dit expressément Spinoza dans le chapitre 4 du traité théologico-politique. Je cite, « Ajoutons que nous ignorons totalement la connexion et l'enchaînement même des choses, c'est-à-dire de quelle façon les choses sont véritablement ordonnées et enchaînées. Donc, pour l'usage de la vie, il vaut mieux, bien plus, c'est indispensable, considérer les choses comme possibles. » Ainsi, c'est le maintien nécessaire de la catégorie de possible qui est la porte ouverte à la superstition. Les choses, au lieu de nous apparaître comme nécessaires ou impossibles, nous apparaissent comme des possibles également susceptibles d'advenir. Et donc, en proie aux affects et à la fluctuation animée, nous tentons de prévoir l'imprévisible pour calmer la crainte et faire pencher la balance de notre côté par un comportement qui échappe aux lois ordinaires des événements, car ces lois habituelles ne nous donnent pour l'instant aucune réponse. Nous allons donc chercher des signes, des présages ou des prodiges pour déterminer s'il y a des causes qui vont ou non produire ce que nous craignons ou désirons. Alors, si le mécanisme du prodige reproduit la vision téléologique dans sa structure, pour ce qui concerne la structure du présage, ce n'est pas tellement le préjudice de la fidélité qui est en jeu que la pensée imaginative et une conception erronée de la causalité qui repose sur des associations et des analogies avec une situation heureuse ou malheureuse passée. Je cite ici la préface paragraphe 2. « Si lorsqu'ils sont en proie à la crainte, ils voient arriver quelque chose qui leur rappelle un bien ou un mal passé, ils, donc les hommes, ils pensent y trouver l'annonce d'une issue heureuse ou malheureuse, et pour cette raison, bien que déçus 100 fois, ils le nomment présage favorable ou funeste. » Fin de citation. Or, nous ne pouvons pas faire autrement que de penser par signe face au possible, tant que nous ignorons si les causes qui posent l'existence de ce que nous désirons sont déterminées ou non à les produire. Et donc, tenaillés par la crainte, nous allons chercher des indices jusque dans les entrailles des animaux. La superstition s'enracine en définitive dans la recherche d'une forme de puissance au sein de l'impuissance, parce que nous ne savons pas ce qui va advenir et nous ne pouvons pas le savoir. Nous faisons comme si tout et son contraire étaient possibles pour satisfaire nos désirs immodérés. L'attitude superstitieuse constitue donc la version inadéquate de la puissance d'agir. Elle possède une positivité, parce qu'elle exprime au départ un refus de se laisser balloter par la fortune, Mais cette recherche d'une prise repose sur une méprise et redouble l'impuissance. Mais dans l'impuissance, c'est toujours bien une puissance d'agir qui s'affirme, mais une puissance de degré moindre ou amoindrie, parce que l'action va se retourner en son contraire, la passion. La superstition ne cesse pas pour autant, elle renaît de ses cendres, puisque l'avenir de nos désirs n'est jamais sûr. Ainsi, on change de superstition, mais pas la superstition. Merci pour votre attention.
Peut-être tu veux répondre à sa question
oui, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, quelque chose comme ça.
Comme tu fais.
I'll answer in English, if that's okay. On the first point is that that in my paper I didn't distinguish carefully enough between superstition and the teleological conception of nature, and that's right. There is something more to superstition than just the teleological conception of nature, although I'm sure you would agree that they're very closely connected with one another. But there is a distinction. And in your second point, your argument, as far as I can understand it, is that the main feature of superstition arises from uncertainty about what it is that's going to happen in the future. So there's a sense in which, we don't know whether or not we are going to lose our goods, what's going to happen to us, and so on. And that's really at the heart of what it is that's going on with superstition. I certainly agree that is important, and that's not an element that I was talking about. But it seems to me that the teleological conception of nature is still extremely important in superstition, and that superstition could not arise unless we also had, in addition to the fear that arises from the uncertainty of the future, if we didn't have, in addition to that, the idea that nature operates teleologically, that there's purposes for things. So yes, I think that both of your points are definitely worth considering, and that there's a more complicated story. But still, I think in the end, that it is not altogether unfair to say that Spinoza is transforming superstition in an interesting way, taking something that is initially very negative and making it into something that can actually support people behaving in accordance with the moral rules that he sets out in the ethics, and that will support the stability of a society.
Merci. Jacqueline?
Merci. Je voudrais revenir sur l'interprétation des 7 dogmes de la foi universelle. Parce que ces dogmes, à part le 7e, peuvent être soit déduits comme la conclusion d'un théorème, et on peut les déduire à partir des données de l'éthique, c'est ce qu'a fait Matron dans Le Christ et le salut des ignorants, sauf le pardon. Parce que le pardon n'a de sens qu'entre 2 personnes. Les lois de la nature ne peuvent pardonner à personne, et on ne peut pas demander pardon aux lois de la nature, mais on peut demander pardon à Dieu ou à son prochain. Et moi, je dirais plutôt que ces théorèmes peuvent avoir une interprétation imaginative qui suppose un étant fictif qui est le Dieu personnel. Le Dieu personnel auquel on obéit, soit par crainte, soit par amour. Parce que dans le chapitre 4, si mes souvenirs sont bons, du TTP, Spinoza, qui reprend l'essentiel de ces dogmes, dit aussi qu'on peut concevoir Dieu comme un juge, mais aussi comme un frère ou comme un ami, en reprenant justement l'enseignement du Christ. Et donc, qu'on ait besoin de ces dogme quand on n'est pas toujours sage. Il n'y a pas que la masse ignorante, il y a aussi le sage qui n'est pas toujours sage, comme il est dit à la fin du chapitre 15. Qu'on en ait besoin prouve qu'on ne peut pas se passer de certains modèles des temps fictifs, y compris de ce Dieu personnel, qu'on abandonnera quand on sera arrivé à la sagesse. Mais non seulement je ne dirais pas que ce sont des superstitions, mais je ne dirais même pas qu'ils conduisent tous à une superstition, si on était vraiment avancé dans le chemin de la sagesse, puisque il me semble bien que Spinoza a dit, alors tous ceux qui savent l'éthique par cœur me diront où ça se trouve dans la 4e partie, mais que si le remords est toujours mauvais, un homme qui serait incapable de repentir serait quand même quelqu'un d'extrêmement dangereux. Donc le repentir peut avoir une validité pragmatique. Et si le repentir a une validité pragmatique, alors le pardon aussi. Voilà.
Je ne sais pas exactement que dire, mais c'est évident quand même. Je sais que Matterhorn, par exemple, pense que tous les dogmes peuvent être interprétés dans un mode qui est tout à fait consistant avec... sauf le 7e. Mais oui, c'est évident, il me semble que ça c'est une conception de Dieu vraiment anthropomorphique. Dans le TDP, oui.
Dans le TDP, oui. Mais puisqu'on peut trouver une correspondance exacte dans l'éthique, cela veut dire que de ces dogmes qui sont le noyau de la religion vraie, ces dogmes, on peut avoir une conception juste, une conception du second genre, si vous voulez, pas du premier.
Il faut penser.
Oui.
Ouais. Moi, je pense que même pour le 7e, on peut trouver une interprétation philosophique. Mais bon, un pardon naturel.
Thank you both for the paper and the response. I agree with most of your paper, Dan. But I think that one of the important consequences that follows from seeing superstition as wider than just a teleological framework is a fuller recognition of how dangerous it can be potentially. And of course, this I think should be linked also to the fact that the TTP, to a certain extent, was, in terms of the timing of its writing, was a divergence, after all, from the ethics. Yeah. So he stopped working on the ethics, wrote the TTP because he was worried about a changing situation. What was the changing situation? Well, the multitude are always a problem, of course, because they're not rational for Spinoza. But they're becoming a bigger problem at a certain time politically, as Jan de Witt's true freedom weakened and so on in the late 1660s. So this made it more urgent to find some way to, and of course that is his starting theme in the preface of the TTP. If you want to avoid or weaken or change a tyrannical political system or the threat of a tyrannical political system into something better, you have to weaken superstition. If you don't weaken superstition, you can't succeed in confronting political danger, which is the situation he's facing in the late, he and his group of his friends in the late 1660s. So you've got to weaken superstition as well as transform it. And I think this element of weakening was perhaps not sufficiently present in, so, and I think the need to do something about superstition, to weaken it by changing it into something less dangerous, would have been not so obvious in Spinoza's mind before the actual point at which he starts writing the TTP in the late 1660s. So, so this element of divergence and this element of the danger posed by superstition, and therefore, since you can't eliminate superstition, you've got to transform it into a faith which is still superstition, but it's a less dangerous form of superstition. So there's an element of criticism, but basically...
Well, I think I thought that was my thesis.
It is your thesis, but I think that but your thesis lacked this historical dimension.
No. Obviously, the question is why then, why there? Is he doing this? But I think that fundamentally, I think that we're in agreement about what it is that he's doing.
Again, I say fundamentally we're in agreement.
I don't know if it's my turn. Thank you. I'd like to make an ecumenical suggestion, although I think Chantal might be more resistant, that in the face of the incertitude of natural events and the belief in possibility as opposed to necessity, I wonder whether Spinoza wouldn't agree that unless you think that the origin of the uncertainty lies in the unpredictable behavior or volitions of an agent, that superstition only makes sense if you think that behind the unpredictability of nature is an agent who can be placated through superstitious behaviors, which in the end, so Chantal is right that we need the element of possibility and unpredictability, but superstition and the kinds of religious behaviors that Spinoza is concerned with will only arise if we also have the teleology of an agent behind that unpredictability.
I'll accept that compromise.
En partie parce que la superstition, il y a la superstition qui serait attachée à la religion et qui suppose effectivement qu'on admette un agent, mais il y a des types de superstitions qui sont des manières de conjurer la crainte qui n'impliquent pas la croyance en des dieux ou des agents, parce qu'on pense être soi-même l'agent. C'est-à-dire si on adopte tel comportement, on va produire tel effet, et ça s'apparentera à une conduite magique, sans qu'il y ait forcément un agent extérieur à soi. Donc je suis en partie d'accord. Voilà.
Edwin.
One thing, the definition of faith did change in the final version.
Oh, I know it did, but not in exactly this way, I think.
That's right, yeah.
We still disagree a little bit about that.
Yes. And you're wrong. But I wanted to support something that Jonathan said, which I thought was right. You say at the beginning of the paper that it would be reasonable to expect that Spinoza would try to eliminate superstition. And Jonathan rightly, I think, talked about weakening superstition. It's not something you can eliminate.
Yeah.
And so it's not reasonable to expect.
And in fact, he doesn't.
Yeah.
No.
Although
I'm
at least that's my argument.
I'm on the side of those who think that the dogmas of the universal faith can all of them be given a philosophical interpretation.
They can all be given a philosophical interpretation, but in order for them to actually be efficacious in producing obedience, you need a teleological conception of the God.
I disagree about that.
Well, if we're talking about obedience to a law, what Spinoza suggests in the note on chapter 16 is, if you're going to think of these as laws to which one has got to be obedient, then you have to have a conception of a lawgiver, and that's inevitably going to be a teleological conception or an anthropomorphic conception of God as a prince. He uses the word prince there.
So first, a very small remark on the 7 tenets of universal faith. I mean, I would tend to agree with Dan in the sense that I think they can be giving philosophical interpretations, but that doesn't seem to be what Spinoza is hinting at. If you look at what he says for each of these tenets, then he tries to explain after what he means by them, and the explanations on the interpretations of them that he provides himself are pretty much all of them within the range of the anthropomorphic conception of God. So that seems to be what he's going for here, at least in Spinoza's intention. But my question to Dan is more, maybe one of the reasons why Chantal feels uncomfortable with the view is that I have the impression there's sort of a slide in the way that you perceive superstition or the presence of superstition from the beginning to the end of the paper, but you don't seem to hold the same thesis. I mean, you begin out by saying that he doesn't eliminate superstition completely, and then you say that the ground of superstition is teleology.
Yeah.
And then at the end of the paper, you say there's still teleology, and then there's two ways of using teleology. One is superstition, one is not. So in that case, what remains is not superstition, it's teleology.
Yeah.
In that case, superstition is just a bad way of using teleology.
Yeah, I may be guilty of that. I think, no, it's seriously, I think after Chantal's comments, no, I really do have to think about what exactly is the relationship between teleology and superstition, and whether the thesis is really about superstition or about the persistence of teleology in the TTP. But that's right, I do slide, and the thesis at the end may not be exactly what it is that I promise at the beginning.
Pascal?
I just want to know
Micro.
Je voudrais juste savoir, I would like to know the naturalist interpretation of pardon by Pierre-François Moreau, please.
Si tu y tiens, tu l'auras. Spinoza cite la phrase de Salomon, la punition du sot, c'est sa sottise. Si le pardon, ça consiste à relever quelqu'un de sa punition, à ce moment-là, le pardon, ça consiste à relever le sot de sa sottise. C'est-à-dire que quelqu'un qui regrette réellement son action ne la fera pas une deuxième fois. Et c'est en cela que consiste le pardon naturel. Il n'y a pas besoin d'intervention surnaturelle. Si tu as commis plusieurs fois l'erreur de mettre ta main au-dessus d'un réchaud brûlant, finalement, tu ne le referas plus. C'est ça le pardon de la nature.
Mais pas par repentir, par compréhension. Parce que le repentir,
Non.
c'est une tristesse.
Évidemment, c'est une tristesse, bien entendu. Mais tout ce qui est dans les 7 dogmes de la religion qui sont énoncés par Spinoza, ça renvoie effectivement à des passions tristes. Non, mais c'est conçu d'une façon triste. Enfin, ce n'est pas conçu adéquatement, je veux dire, ça renvoie à des conceptions inadéquates.
Je rajoute ma question, mais alors du coup, entre pardon et providence, il n'y a pas de différence.
C'est Lorenzo. Là, on est en train de discuter leur position, pas les miennes.
Non, là, je continue le dialogue avec Pascal. Ah, pardon, alors c'est pas grave.
Est-ce qu'il y a des questions sur l'exposé de Dan et sur la réponse?
A quick question. Another angle to take, which I think connects the two papers, is the role of free will, because in the appendix to part 1 of the Ethics, Spinoza cites the belief that we're free as acting. And it's also connected then to the thing that we act for an end. So teleology comes into play in a mistaken conception of will, but it also is connected to the uncertainty, the possibility of being able to act otherwise. So I'm wondering whether both of you could say something about that aspect, how that contributes to the role of superstition, another dimension of teleology.
Well, as in the appendix to Ethics 1, of course, Spinoza does say it is because we mistakenly think that we have free will and that we act for an end that we attribute that to nature as well. But also there is the fact that, in obedience, the very idea of obedience means that, we do have a choice. Do we obey or do we not? And we look at the consequences of obedience, which is to say we will be rewarded by the lawgiver or by the prince, or disobedience, we will be punished by the prince. And on that basis, choose what it is that we're going to do on the basis of consequences. It's interesting. I mean, with the view in the ethics, the idea that we love our neighbors as ourselves and love God above all once we understand them, it's not a matter of choice. It is just something that we do, that follows, I think as he says, as the light follows from the sun, right? So again, you're right that question of will enters into but it's in the case of obedience, it's our will that enters into the TTP in a way in which it doesn't seem to enter into the ethics. The belief is completely, it just follows necessarily.
Je pense que effectivement dans la superstition, l'idée d'une volonté libre est renforcée parce que comme on est dans l'incertitude face à l'avenir, on pense des possibles et donc on pense qu'on a le choix et qu'on doit arbitrer entre ces possibles, avoir tel comportement pour éviter celui-là ou pour faire advenir tel. Donc la superstition va nécessairement être reliée avec l'illusion d'un libre arbitre et d'un pouvoir de choix entre des possibles.
Yeah, Dan, I think that there is, just one small point. I think that there is a much more systematic relationship between this pile of errors. I mean, what happens in the appendix to part one is, what happens in the appendix to part one is that Spinoza typically suggests an analysis in which you have a pile of errors, one coming after the other. Now, so you have then superstition relying on divine teleology relying on human thoughtful teleology relying on belief in free will. Now, the point is that I think Spinoza thinks that we cannot eradicate the belief in free will because we always have this experience of ourselves as acting without any knowledge of the causes of our action. So then what happens is by modus tollens, by the fact that we cannot eradicate the belief in free will, we cannot eradicate everything that goes up from that.
Well, I'm not sure that we can't. I mean, in a way, that's right. Insofar as Spinoza does think that if we read and understand the ethics, then we can at least come to an intellectual understanding that we do not have free will, that it is an illusion, that we are conscious of our volitions, but not conscious of the causes that determine our volitions, and so on and so forth. So we can, in some sense or another, undermine the idea of free will. Although I think for the common people, it's always going to be there, the idea of free will, right? That illusion, that mistake. And given that we have, in a certain sense, it's kind of like Bacon's idols. There are at least some of the idols that we are just built in such a way that we make these mistakes. Bacon's solution is, well, if we know that we make these mistakes, that we tend to make these mistakes, then we can correct for them because we know that we have a tendency to make those mistakes. And Spinoza's solution, at least for the common people, is a little different. It's by sort of taking this tendency to believe in free will and also to believe in teleology in nature and transforming it in a way where it can lead to good rather than to disorder.